Thank you all. Welcome to the Rocky Mountain Junior Scholars Scholarship Plenary Panel. We're so excited to spend the hour discussing how to improve the impact of our scholarship. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Usually I'm the type of person that kind of tunes out when people are introduced just because it's like, okay, I've heard this all, but I actually think it's really important for you all to listen to some of the aspects of their introduction. I did kind of cue them for this particular purpose, and I want you to kind of listen for things that you might want to strive for in your scholarship, things that might seem interesting to you particularly. Okay, we'll start with our first panelist. So our first panelist is Robin Craig. She's the James I. Farr Presidential Endowed Professor of Law and University Distinguished Scholar at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney's College of Law. Her interdisciplinary scholarship focuses on all things water. So ocean, coastal law, climate change adaptation, resilience theory, and the law are things she researches. She's an elected member of both the American College of Environmental Lawyers and the American Law Institute, and has been appointed to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Congress on Environmental Law. She has been recognized as one of the top 15 most cited faculty in environmental and energy law, one of the top 25 most cited faculty in public law, and one of the top 10 most cited faculty in environmental and administrative law. Her interdisciplinary work has led to her appointment to 6 different National Academy of Sciences committees, and several of her law review articles have been selected by her peers as one of the best in environmental, natural resources, or energy for the year. Her writing has garnered international opportunities as well, including delivering keynote addresses and several other research fellowship opportunities. I also want to mention specifically as of last year, so in 2019, for instance, Robin Craig published an environmental statute book, published 15 articles, including 1 in Vanderbilt Law Review, and 4 book chapters, along with securing 3 book contracts. Okay, so then we'll move on to George, who is equally as impressive. He's a presidential scholar and professor of law at the University of Utah with an adjunct appointment at the Department of Human Genetics. His research focuses on, among other things, intellectual property, technical standardization, antitrust law, and science policy. Professor Contreras is an author of more than 100 scholarly articles, and I made sure to check this. It's been in 9 years of teaching that he's done this, and 1.5 years of pre-market experience, to be kind of exact. His book chapters and his works have appeared in leading journals, including Science, Nature, Georgetown Law Journal, NYU Law Review, Iowa Law Review, Harvard Journal of Law and Technology, and the Berkeley Technology Law Journal, as well as texts published by Oxford, Cambridge, and MIT. According to Google Scholar, George's scholarly articles and other writings have been cited more than 1,800 times, and he's among the top 200 legal scholars in the world in terms of SSRN downloads during the past year. He's the editor of 6 books, an in-depth narrative account of gene patenting, a product of nature, is going to be released this next year. His work has been translated into several languages, and he's lectured and spoken in more than 24 countries around the world. George is sought after by the media as an expert on numerous issues. He's been quoted in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Economist, Washington Post, Bloomberg, Korea Times, and other radio shows, including NPR. His work has been cited by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, European Commission, and courts in the U.S. and Europe. In 2019, George has edited 2 books, wrote 8 law review articles, 6 book chapters, 2 white papers, and 3 governmental reports. Okay, now last but not least, we have Professor Paul Cassell, who is the Ronald N. Boyce Presidential Professor of Criminal Law and University Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Utah. From 2002 to 2007, Professor Cassell holds the unique honor of having served as a U.S. District Court judge for the District of Utah. He resigned his judgeship, that could have been for life, to return to law teaching and writing. Professor Cassell was recently ranked as one of the top 50 most cited law scholars of all time on Hein Online. He's published in the Stanford Law Review, the Michigan Law Review, Northwestern Law Review, among others. He's on the list of the top 50 criminal law professors and occasionally blogs on Volokh conspiracy. He has recently done some high-profile work, including an article, what he calls explaining the recent homicide spikes in the United States cities, the Minneapolis effect, and the decline in proactive policing. This will appear in the December issue of the Federal Sentencing Reporter. And there's been a mini symposium about this piece. He's also highlighted his article in an op-ed that he recently published in the Wall Street Journal. He maintains an active pro bono appellate practice focusing on victims' rights issues, arguing most recently and in the near future on behalf of victims of the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking organization, including a 12-year legal battle where he worked hard to overturn the Epstein non-prosecution agreement. He's also written 2 books and aims to write an article a year, which is ironic because he ends up writing a lot more because he writes when opportunities arise. And so he's going to talk about that today. Okay, so I'm really excited to get to the substance of our panel. I'll start with the first question, which is, how, panelists, do you pick a topic that has high scholarly impact? Do you consider, whether a certain issue will be a good op-ed when you write an article, or whether it will matter to a lot of people? I mean, what are the things you think about?
Well, I'll step up. I think it's important that you love your topic, or at least like it. I write in environmental law, and so what's hot changes a lot over the course of time. Sometimes nothing in environmental law is hot. So I think it's important to pick topics that you can develop over time, which is why one of the first things I started writing about was the Clean Water Act. But also something that's a little unique to you, which is why I got into coral reefs, and about 12 years later found I was the national expert on the law of coral reefs. So you also have to think over the long term.
I can jump in as well. I agree with Robin that you need to love your topic. I mean, you could find the perfect topic, but if it's not of interest to you, it's just really not going to get done. So for me, I tend to come at criminal procedure issues from a different perspective than a lot of others who are writing in the field. So I try to find sort of some conventional wisdom that's grown up around a particular topic that maybe needs to be re-examined. And I've had some luck in the Miranda area and stop and frisk area and some other areas, sort of taking a look at a conventional wisdom and trying to point out some problems in it. I also think one of the big issues you've got to think about when you're selecting a topic is one that I got some advice when I was starting my academic career. Do you concentrate your fire in a particular area, or do you cover the waterfront? And I've heard people argue for both positions. I'm in the Goldilocks position on that one. I think perhaps when you're just starting out, it is useful to concentrate your fire because you can reuse some of the material maybe you've written in another article, focus in on and become sort of the master of a particular area. But I think once you get tenure or start to move to maybe phase 2 of a legal career, it is interesting to branch out a little bit more. So I've developed kind of 2 areas that I focus on. One is criminal procedure, particularly Miranda, and the other is crime victims' rights, which is an area not many people are writing in. So I found it useful to have kind of 2 halves to my career.
Yeah, and I kind of have 2 halves also. And, this isn't something that I sat down at the beginning of my academic career and mapped it out and strategically tried to figure out what I was going to do. I practiced for a lot of years, more than most academics, before I became an academic, and I naturally wrote about some of the things that I worked on when I was in practice. And as it turned out, one of those areas became very hot, very important in litigation around the world, much to my surprise, about 10 or 12 years ago. And that area, which is technical standards and standards essential patents and the litigation around them, that is of extreme interest to practitioners. And so when I write something in that area, it gets downloaded by hundreds and hundreds of practitioners sort of right away, which was quite surprising to me. And the other area that I write about, interestingly, is more interesting to academics. And so that area, which is genomics and the law around genetics, that gets better placements in the law reviews. So my more prestigious placements are in that area, but far fewer practitioners and people outside of the academy are interested in it. It just worked out that way. And like Paul and Robin both said, you've just got to be interested in what you do. You're going to spend a lot of time writing about this stuff. So you'll be awfully bored if you just pick something to write about because you think others are going to be interested in it. The best guide is really what you're interested in.
Great, thank you. Okay, so next question. How do you stay disciplined and write as often as you do?
Well, I'll volunteer. I think it's important to, especially when you're starting out, and especially if writing is not something you just like to sit down and do, schedule writing time into your week, just like any other commitment you have to do as a law professor. And protect that commitment. Treat it as a commitment. No social media or phones while you're writing. Try to turn the emails off or not pay attention to them. And when I was starting, I set a goal of trying to have 5 relatively publishable pages a week, which sounds very manageable. And then you think about it and it adds up to roughly 180 to 200 pages a year, which is at least 2 and probably 3 articles. So I think that's a good goal. Also, know yourself. I mean, I'm a morning writer. If I have to write after 4 p.m., it's not going to happen. So know what works for you, and make sure you protect that time.
I can jump in a little bit, and it's also useful, of course, to have some deadlines to be thinking about. I'm sure everyone is aware of the February 1, window of opportunity for law reviews. So I oftentimes try to work backwards from that. Also over the summer, since there's time to write there, I try to have an internal deadline of maybe August 15th, which is the other window for finishing up articles. In terms of the more micro level of how to get things done, I think practicing lawyers talk about the trap of if you have a brief due in 2 weeks, a lot of lawyers will spend 10 days doing the research and 3 or 4 days at the end writing the thing up. And actually the percentages should be reversed. You need to be spending more time writing and less time researching. And so I guess I'm somewhat like Robin. I try to say, okay, I see this 3-part article. Let's get part 1 written pretty quickly because that's background. Now maybe I'll do a little bit of research, and then part 2 needs to be done by a date certain, and just have those internal working deadlines, and then that helps me a lot.
Great. Okay. So for the next question, I'm going to target this to Robin. So how do you get cited more, and who do you write to? That's one of our, one of the questions that was also submitted, and you kind of thought about this before the panel. So I'd love you to think about or, address that.
Okay. Well, the one question is, who do you want to be cited by? George mentioned there are different audiences and they will react to different pieces differently. I have a couple pieces that have been cited a lot by courts. One of them was called When Daubert Gets Eerie. I happened to time it when a lot of courts were having to figure out what to do with expert witness standards in diversity cases. And it ended up getting picked up by the Sixth Circuit, and that got cited by a lot of courts as a result. The other set of articles I have that gets cited a lot by courts are the public trust doctrine articles, because I summarized everything. So there's one stop shop where they can go and find out, what's up with the public trust doctrine. If you want to be cited by other scholars, it helps to have a series of articles on the same topic, so people start associating you with that topic, and when they're turning to write on it, your name will come to mind. But it also helps to cite broadly yourself. People do pay attention to who's citing them. And that's another way to get your name in their mind. And if you are treating their scholarship respectfully, they will probably return the favor. And then finally, if you want to be cited in multiple disciplines, be the lawyer who can talk to other disciplines, which the article I have that's been cited the most, because it's been cited across the sciences, is Stationarity is Dead, which is about trying to rationalize climate change adaptation law. So know your audience, know what you're aiming for.
Great. So something I'm going to target towards Paul on the same issue of how to get cited more is, do you think it's good to go against the grain of what other scholars have said to kind of create a little bit of interesting controversy?
Yeah, that's been my approach on things. It's funny. I know there have been some articles that have been written about cite counts. And of course, the number one way to get cited is to write the preeminent article in the field. The second best way to get cited is apparently to make what's called the classic mistake, so that everybody cites the article for but C because, somebody missed the boat or whatever. I don't think I write to make classic mistakes, but I do think, for example, in the Miranda area, I've written about how, in my view, that's been harmful for law enforcement, and the conventional wisdom has been Miranda's no big deal. So now when people write about Miranda, my article frequently gets cited for the proposition that, look, there is some controversy about what's going on. Building on that idea of stirring the pot just a little bit, another tactic that I've had to get some of my articles cited is to create, you mentioned in the introduction, kind of a mini symposium. So frequently I'm corresponding with someone on Miranda or another topic, and they'll have the opposite point of view, and they're maybe working on something, and I'll say, hey, let's package our articles together. Let's send them out simultaneously to a law review and see if they want to publish the two of us that are at odds, and that's created a synergistic effect, I think, in some cases.
Great. George?
Right. So I don't disagree with anything that Paul has said on this one. I think I mentioned earlier, there are different audiences who are going to cite you. There are practitioners and there are academics. Both are perfectly valid groups.
Great. Okay, so what is your view of symposia? Kind of the more the better, you pick limited ones. I mean, obviously you guys are well cited, so it'd be good to know what your views are on symposia in general.
George, you want to go first?
Sure. And Shima, you can call on us to
okay.
Just keep this going. Right, so symposia, if you're talking about law review symposia put on by student-edited journals, those are nice. It's always flattering to be invited to speak and to submit something at a symposium. They come in two flavors. Some the obligation is to submit an article and publish it in the review, and some it's just to go and talk. There's definitely no downside to talking at one of these. The ones with publication requirements and expectations you should be more careful about, especially early in your career. You should be choosy about which ones you decide to publish in. It can be tempting to know that, okay, I'm going to write this article and it's got a placement already. I don't have to go through the tedium of Scholastica in February or August and try to get the thing placed. But you also don't want to place it too low when you could potentially get a better placement if you just went into the open placement market in February or August. So I would be selective. There's no shame in turning down an invitation, or if it's not a journal you're interested in publishing in, asking them if you can speak or if they'd like you to speak, but don't have an article for them.
Great. How do you get to know people in your field? I know that's something that's come up when you're thinking about getting cited. You first have to kind of get to know people that are writing in your space. So how have you found that that's been effective? I think maybe Robin could speak to that first, and then Paul.
All right. Well, environmental law, fortunately, has some very easy ways to get to know people. We have a biannual conference that is just for environmental law profs, and part of it is always about teaching as well as scholarship, as well as just topics that are out there. And so the advice I got when I was starting out is you will go to this conference, and it was the correct advice. I got to meet almost everybody in my field in one conference, and developed some relationships that have lasted my entire career and have had some very beneficial payoffs, if you want to put it that way, in other ways. But you have to be visible. And so I would actually differ a little from George on the symposium issue, because if it's the first time you've been invited out, so to speak, you might want to go just so you start meeting people and start participating, and critical that you do a good job, because that's how you get the next and better invitations. But you need to be posting to SSRN. You need to have a Google Scholar account. If you do interdisciplinary work like George and I do, you need an ORCID ID. Join the listserv for the law professors in your area. Send out your article titles and abstracts, 2 or 3 times a year. Contact more senior people who are writing in areas that interest you, and send them drafts to see if they'll review them. Sometimes you get lucky. But like, so you need to become visible. People will cite who they know, and they will think of you because they know you. So get out there and play.
That's really good advice. Paul, did you want to talk about congressional contacts and blogging and all the things you do?
Sure, yeah, just a couple of thoughts on what Robin said. I agree with everything she said. Let me just amplify one point she made, contacting senior people. When I was a young scholar and I started writing in the Miranda area, I think it's fair to say that Yale Camisar was the nation's leading expert on that. And so I had my article and I sent it to him, and he was very generous with his time and offering suggestions. And we developed a good friendship, even though we didn't see the doctrine in the same way between the two of us. And that was very valuable for me to get cited by him and get invited to different places where he was being invited. And he was very generous with his time and so forth. So don't be shy about reaching out to people. Also, you mentioned congressional contacts. I've Utah for many years had Senator Hatch, who was the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and he was frequently looking for researchers or witnesses to testify on legislation. And I always stayed in close contact with his staff when a bill was coming through that was of interest to me. And there even were some Miranda bills coming through. He was nice enough to invite me out to testify, and that created opportunities that way as well.
And then do you want to talk about blogging quickly?
Yeah, I mean, one of the
op-eds.
Yeah, so one of the key ways, how does people find out about your article? Shima mentioned that I left my judgeship, and my wife always wondered why, because she said, look, Paul, right now you have 2 people reading your stuff, the plaintiff and the defendant. Why would you want to go to a job where nobody reads your stuff? So that was an excellent point. But one of the ways you get people to read things is they have to know it's out there. So I'm an occasional blogger on the Volokh conspiracy, which gets a fair amount of traffic, including some, I think, keen legal observers that are out there. And so whenever I publish an article, I try to make a point to get it up there. I first put it on SSRN, and then I'll do a blog post on Volokh with the SSRN link. And so that's the way people can access the thing and start talking about it. Also, Shima mentioned with my recent paper on homicide spikes, I knew that was a subject in the news and would be of interest to newspapers. So I was able to contact the Wall Street Journal editorial page and do an op-ed, which again linked to my SSRN version of the article. And right after the op-ed piece, I tracked it over the next 3 days. I think I got 500 or 600 downloads, which were presumably coming from the Wall Street Journal link.
Great. Any other ways you guys would recommend getting more downloads, more people engaging in your scholarship? I mean, Twitter's one thing I don't think any of you guys are really big on, but what are some other ways you guys use to get people to read your work?
Well, George and I have been mentioning different audiences. I always laugh because for a period of my career, I did the Supreme Court news for the ABA's administrative law section. And every once in a while I would, categorize the cases and write them up into an article and get it published. And whenever those went up on SSRN, they were instantaneously downloaded in droves because every administrative law professor in the United States was getting the handy dandy cheat sheet. So, you know, is that the work I'm proudest of? No. Does it still have a fairly heavy download count? Yes. So again, you know, what is it you're trying to achieve is important. The other thing I would just emphasize is, you know, personal connections do matter, and be nice to people. If a reporter calls you and says, I don't understand this area of law, can you take a half an hour and explain it to me? If you can, do, because they will remember that you were the person who helped them out when they got changed to a new beat. Connections come back in interesting ways. I had a connection in Florida that I invited her to speak in my Florida water law class when I taught there. She went on to write some very well-received books, which landed her a job writing for National Geographic, which it ended up with me being interviewed for National Geographic. So, you know, like a lot of it is personal connections and people recognizing who you are. So be nice.
And George, I want to hear from you as well. You've been well cited by national media outlets. How did that come about? Was it just by pure getting your work out and they just saw it, or did you do anything to be proactive about that?
Yeah, so undoubtedly the first few calls from reporters, they come mostly from recommendations by other academics, right? You talk to a reporter, one of the things they'll often ask you at the end is like, who else should I talk to get a perspective on this thing? And so, as like Robin and Paul both said, getting known by your colleagues in the area is good, and especially getting known by people who do something that's not exactly what you do, but is related enough that they know it, and they say, oh, well, if you want the real expert on this thing, talk to that person. But after that, after you get a few, then cultivate your relationships with reporters. You know, like every other job, reporters can be lazy. They don't want to do like a search, you know, literature search every time they've got a story on some related topic. They want to call the people who they know, and so return their calls. The other thing about reporters is, you know, we think we have deadlines. Our deadlines are 6 months out. Their deadlines are like the next day, or, you know, 12 hours from now. So check your email. You know, do not be one of those people who doesn't check your email over the weekend. I hate to say, you know, so this is not a work-life balance seminar, right? Always check your email. You know, I respond to emails like within 10 minutes if I'm not doing something like this. And so they'll appreciate that kind of speedy response, and they'll remember it. They'll, you know, you'll be the one that they can call for comment when they've got something that's pressing, or something that's hot off the presses. I also want to say something about SSRN. Which is, you know, SSRN is a really incredible tool that not enough academics use well. I think Robin and Paul use it very well, but I'll speak for all of the good users. So SSRN, you can post pretty much anything. It doesn't just have to be law reviews in progress. Number one, be good about updating your SSRN uploads. When an article gets published, law reviews have the most lenient copyright policies in the world, and that's thanks to a bunch of IP professors who made this happen about 20 years ago, right? So thank us. But so you post the final paginated version, because law professors are lazy too. And so if you want people to cite your article and they know they're going to have to get pin cites for it, have the published version on SSRN. Also, if you do blog posts, you can do blog posts on SSRN, sort of spruce it up so that it looks more like something with footnotes. Again, making it easier for people to use it. You do an amicus brief, that can go up on SSRN. And then in your blog posts, like, link back to the SSRN pieces. All of these tweets and LinkedIn messages and blog posts, they're all advertisements for your main body of work, which is your real scholarship, the articles. But all of them can lead people back to those big articles. And eventually there's just like a critical mass of these things, like when the article, when you first write it, when it gets accepted for publication, when it is published. Like, those are three contact points that you can have to get the word out about your favorite article. So I do that.
While we're talking about SSRN, George, I want to hear from you first, and then let's go Robin and Paul about when you post on SSRN initially. It seems like you definitely edit once you post, but do you post when it's accepted or before that point? Tell us when you guys post. So George first.
I post before.
Okay.
Why is that? I mean, remember, in the e-journals that SSRN distributes, you only get one shot at those, right? So you have to have something that's deep. Don't just post an abstract with an outline, right? It has to be something that somebody can read as an article. But I post it early for a number of reasons. Number one is because I want to get feedback. I send that link around to all the people who I think might have some comments for me on the article. Number two, you kind of claim the topic. You don't want to be scooped. We're like reporters, right? We want to be the first one to make some brilliant observation about the law. And if somebody sees, that person, I mean, this doesn't stop everybody. It doesn't stop the laziest people or students. No offense to our students, but most people who are doing thorough research are not going to write an article about something that you've already got an article about on SSRN, even if it's not accepted. So I go as early as I've got something decent that people aren't going to laugh at.
And so George, then at that point you're giving up the kind of buzz of getting your NYU placement because then it's not redistributed when you get your accepted offer. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. But that's okay because I post that on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Facebook, and you're right. And then also the people who read the article, if they read it off SSRN, they're just reading a draft. But hopefully they go back and find the cited version, when they're going to go cite it, or the paginated final version when they're going to go cite it in their own article. So that is a trade-off. You're right.
Yeah. Okay, Robin and Paul, I want to hear from you guys as well on that issue.
When I can, and I agree with George, law reviews have the easiest copyrights in the world. Interdisciplinary journals don't always, so you have to be a little careful if you're publishing in different disciplines. But with law articles, I agree with George. I usually put it up on SSRN as I'm submitting it. So it's not published, but it's in good enough shape that I'm willing to send it out to journals. And then religious about updating at acceptance stage, at that stage in the editing where you've got the proof that's just about to go out, and then the final article when it comes out in print. In other disciplines, you have to be a little more careful about what can be posted and when. So the timing on those can vary considerably, and I've got a couple of articles where I actually can't put it on SSRN until after it's been in print for 2 years. So keep a calendar of those, by the way, if you do that, so when you can put things up on SSRN. The other thing I think that's important about SSRN and that has changed since I've been doing SSRN is it's now really easy to post in SSRN journals from other fields. So always use all 12 you're allowed. There are 12 places in there somewhere. You can send out every article, but don't be afraid to go looking in the other disciplines that are out there now to find those other placements. And that's actually a really good way to let people in related disciplines know that you exist.
So great. Paul, do you have anything to add to that? When do you post on SSRN?
Yeah, I post early the way Robin and George do. And one thing just that I do that perhaps some others don't do is my target audience is to try to influence public policy and specifically crime control policy. So the way I've had some luck is I've written a couple of articles recently about crime spikes in Chicago, for example. And so I went to the Chicago Tribune and said, look, I'm going to be posting on SSRN on February 1st, my new research. If you would like, I will give you the exclusive option of being the first one. I'll give you the timing of that release. And if you want, you can be the first one to report it. And in both cases, the Chicago Tribune went forward with a story about my research, including the link. And that was one way to generate discussion in the area that I want to generate discussion in Chicago about how to address criminal justice issues there.
That's really clever. I like that. Okay. So one thing I wanted to talk about too is, a lot of times young scholars are asked to be disciplined and don't get interrupted. So if you're writing a law review article and some awesome thing happens, just ignore everything, kind of like stay disciplined, do your work regardless. But I have a feeling you guys have different opinions on that. So first I want to hear from Robin and then Paul.
Okay, so do you stop everything and go hit the new hot topic? This is an it depends. I'm sorry about that. But first off, I'm very rarely writing only one thing to begin with. So I actually hesitate to count at the moment, but it's at least 6 different things I've got in progress right now. So that tunnel vision focus is long stopped being a part of my life. And even when I was junior, I always had at least 2 things going because I get bored easy, quite frankly, and I need to be able to switch between things as interests me at the moment. But there are things I care about and there are things I don't, so, or not as much. And so if something comes up on ocean law, which has happened a couple of times, yeah, I will stop and jump on that because I am one of the few ocean scholars out there. I took a break to be lead drafter on an amicus brief because it was the first time an issue had been tested, and quite frankly, I wanted to make sure that certain arguments got in front of the court, and that led to some op-eds. There are others. I also do the Clean Water Act. There's a lot of things that go on with the Clean Water Act. Some of them are in my bailiwick. Some of them are more tangential. There are a lot of us out there that do the Clean Water Act. So sometimes when that's hot in the news, I don't feel as compelled to drop everything else and work on it. Of course, it also depends, as Paul mentioned, about deadlines. If there are actual deadlines coming up, that will influence the decision as well. So like I said, kind of depends, but yeah, there are topics I will stop for.
Great. Paul, and then I'll go to George if you have something to add.
Yeah, obviously it depends. I'm more on the strike while the iron is hot side of things. For example, this summer there were these homicide spikes occurring around the country and an enormous national interest in those. So I said, I'm going to be the person to explain what's going on, and I've got to get this article out in a matter of weeks. So I worked hard through August to get that out, and it did get some attention. The other thing that I do that's sort of perhaps different than some others, I do a lot of pro bono litigation for crime victims. And typically that's on a very short time fuse because I'll get a call. Like back in July of 2008, I got this call from a lawyer in Florida that said, look, there's this fellow, Jeffrey Epstein, and we think he's getting some kind of a deal. Can you help me file a brief tomorrow? So I had to move quickly on that. And then that's produced a number of publication opportunities and litigation opportunities from moving so quickly.
That's great. You gave up your summer, but it was worthwhile, Paul. Like you said, it's not a lifestyle panel. No summer breaks for you guys. George?
So I agree. I agree with what Robin and Paul have said, and I won't repeat it. But one thing that I will note is that, if to organize all these projects, and like I've got a dozen different projects going on at any given time. I've got things like at the very beginning, I've got RAs that are still like doing a bunch of field research, data collection, all the way through whatever, they're in the writing process, they're in the editing process, they're accepted, they're moving toward, comments coming in. So to keep track of there's no way to keep track of all of that stuff other than to have for me, like a prioritized to-do list. On if you've got an iPhone, there's that notepad. And like multiple times a day, I am adjusting and calibrating and moving things up and down that list. I take them off when I do them and I add things on. And so if an important case drops in an area that I am following where people will expect me to say something about the case, yeah, that goes to the top of the list. Now, maybe there was something else at the top of the list, like I had to prepare for property class the next day. Well, so then it goes second. We have our priorities, but everything works. And like the law review article that's due in February, well, that's like 3.5 months from now. So I'll get back to it. And that drops down on the list. But having that list, and for me, manipulating it like multiple times a day is literally the only thing that allows me to keep all of these things juggled, and frankly, just not to forget what I've got to be doing in the next few hours.
That's really helpful. And I don't know if a lot of people would have felt that that was the answer you would have given. So all three of you basically have said you will put aside, further deadlines to hit hot topics that are happening. And I think that's one critical thing that, hopefully in all of our junior scholars' mind right now is thinking, okay, this is maybe something I should think about doing in my career. I love that. Okay, something that I think people will want to hear about is all of you have had top placements in T14 journals. How did you get your top placements? I don't want to hear anything about randomness or luck. Did you have any inside channels? Would you recommend that? What do you think matters? Kind of give us whatever tips you have. Let's start with Robin, then Paul, then George again on this one.
Okay. I write a variety of different things, and so one rule is don't waste editors' time. There are things I write that are hardcore environmental law. Only people that are into the weeds of the Clean Water Act are going to care. And I don't, I send those out to top specialty journals. I don't bother with the general journals because I know it's not going to place in a general journal I'd like. But the people at all the specialty journals know me now, and again, do a good job when you get the placement, because they do, believe it or not, have institutional memories at student-run law reviews. But when I'm doing something that's got a more administrative law bent or a more constitutional law bent that I think can place in a good general journal. One trick I learned from a colleague a while back was that sometimes it helps to start where you're pretty sure it'll place, and then week by week try and peg it up the food chain. That takes some time. It's got to be an article that you care about doing it for. But it also helps once you get to know who the article editor is. If you're starting to ask for things like expedited reviews, it still helps to email them with a copy of the article attached, and then not wince when you realize they've been reviewing it during one of their classes, because that's what they do, unfortunately. But always attach the article when you're asking an editor to do anything, and contact them personally, as well as go through Scholastica or whatever submission software you're using. Write excellent abstracts. The letter that accompanies it may or may not get read, but an abstract will. And I have heard from several articles editor that they decide on abstracts. So pay attention to what you put in the abstract, and don't just repeat your conclusion. Do explain why it's important. So yeah, but like I said, don't waste editors' time. If you know in your heart it's not going to place, go for a good specialty journal, or where it does matter. Last thing I'll mention is if you do fall submission, don't be afraid to pull it if you're getting rejected just because journals are full. If you know it should be placing better than it is, pull it and wait till spring.
I love that. And do you want to mention quickly, Robin, before we move on to Paul, how your last, I thought it was interesting that, did Vanderbilt Law Review approach you for your last article? That was a pretty neat thing. I don't know if you have a story for that, or that was just happenstance.
Yeah, this was on the Good Symposium. So it was a symposium, and quite frankly, being run by a couple of friends of mine. So you want an inside track? Yeah, that was an inside track. But
you get your friends at T14 schools to run Symposia.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So.
All right, Paul, and then George.
Yeah, Robin has covered a lot of this already. Let me just highlight a couple of things that she mentioned. I think the cover letter is very important. You don't have a chance to sit down with the law review editors and say, hey, here's why you should take my piece. So the cover letter is that opportunity. And suppose you were sitting down with, a student editor at a top journal. Why should you take this piece? That's what the letter should say. And everything in the letter should focus on that. A lot of times my articles will have a current event that I tie into a court case or something that I'll mention. I've also previously mentioned if you have a colleague who just happens to be writing on the same issue and you can package the two articles together. I've had some luck mentioning in the cover letter, hey, we've already got a little mini symposium here if you take both of our articles, and the journals seem to like that. One last thing that I guess is overlooked, I try to have my article ready to publish, particularly all the blue booking is ready to roll, because the last thing a law review editor wants to take is, oh no, I'm going to, I have to be blue booking this thing forever. So I just have one of my research assistants here who's on the law review, make sure all my footnotes are blue book perfect. And then they can, that doesn't become a distraction from hopefully the merits of the article.
So Paul, just to clarify, the mini symposium cell thing that you've done, have you done that with top journals and they've been willing to take them?
Yes. So sometimes it's been their suggestion and sometimes it's been mine. I think the best examples these are a bit older, but when I was writing articles on Miranda saying how it was harming law enforcement, that was very much against conventional wisdom. So they would say, well, you're going out on a limb here. Is there somebody who takes the opposite point of view? And I would say, well, yeah, call your colleague here at where, for example, at Stanford, I published there, and they called John Donahue, who was an econometrician who had a different point of view on that. We packaged he wrote a response, and then I wrote a reply, and that became fairly widely cited in the area.
That's great. Okay, George.
Yeah, I'll just add a few other little tidbits to what Robin and Paul have said. I mean, first though, I'll disagree with Robin. Do waste law review editors' time. Why not? Right? Even if it's a highly technical article, go ahead, send it out. It does cost your school something like $5 to send it out, but you could always get a hit or a bite from an editor who just happened to read an article about this thing at some point. So I have no hesitation about wasting their time. That being said, it is definitely true that highly technical articles are not going to place in the general student edited law reviews, or they're not going to place decently. My most complicated pieces is sort of the intersection of standardization, patent law, and antitrust law, right? This is something that is taught in like very few law school classes other than like mine, around the country. And so students have never heard of it. It's complicated. They can't wade through it. They're just going to pass over it. So those go to like highly ranked specialty journals. And like in my field, the Antitrust Law Journal gets more Supreme Court citations than Harvard, Stanford, and Yale law reviews like put together, right? So for people in the field, that's a great placement. For generalists, they've never heard of it. There are specific types of articles that will get placed in good student-edited law reviews, right? And there are signals that you give to the editors when you make your submission, right? I mean, you've got to be able to say some of this stuff with a straight face, but you've got to describe the importance of your article. As Paul said, in the cover letter and in the abstract, you've got to say why it's important, why it's novel, like why you're the first one to say this, without, and then like before it gets published, take that stuff out, because it's embarrassing. Like your colleagues who look at that and say, oh, right, give me a break. You were certainly not the first to say that. But guess what? The students have no clue, and they do zero research into the background to know whether you're the first or the 10 millionth person to make an argument if it wasn't excerpted in their casebook from their Winnow classes. So say it's novel if you've got a decent argument for that. Also, have a dialogue with the literature. If you want to be in like a top 10 journal, cite people in top 10 journals and say like how you are dialoguing with the scholarly discourse that Professor so-and-so from fancy law school so-and-so said, right? Disagreeing with Professor so-and-so will grab attention, but then you're disagreeing with Professor so-and-so who's going to read this thing, so you better make sure you're pretty confident of that position. But otherwise, the topics, there are topics of general interest, and it's what's hot. It's what people are teaching in seminar classes all around the country. You can cater to that, but do it only if you're truly interested in it. Don't do it just to try to get placements, because that'll come off as non-genuine, and then you won't have had a good time writing the article.
George, I want to ask you, just follow up on that issue of engaging with other scholarship, how do you give the editors that info? Is it something you put in the cover letter saying, I'm disagreeing with X professor from this person, or agreeing with, how do they get that info from you?
It's at a minimum going to be in the introduction, right? I mean, most editors will not read more than the introduction. You're lucky if you're going to get one who reads the introduction. I'd say maybe a third to half are going to read the intro if it's a decent article, from someone who seems legitimate. So it's got to be in the intro with a lot of footnotes to, the fancy law reviews and Professor X. If it's a central point of like you're writing a response to, Melamed and Calabresi, like that goes in the abstract and the cover letter. But you don't have to do that, right? It can just be a dialogue. It can be your own idea. It can be something from a case development. But in the introduction, in the first like 3 to 4 pages, make it clear that you're in there in that high level scholarly discussion.
Yes. Something I want to ask about, a couple people have brought up, how do you use a library, RAs? I know we had some other questions, but I wanted you guys to briefly talk about that. I think, George, you might have mentioned it, and if Robin and Paul also have something after, but I might go to you first on this one, George. When you have 12 things going on, which you said, which I believe at one time, how do you decide, what to assign to RAs? Do you have library help? What do you make sure you do yourself? I mean, are you kind of the final check? So tell us how, tell a junior scholar how to be more effective and efficient like you and use resources around them.
Yeah, no, that's right, because I thought a lot about this. And every school is going to be different in terms of how they, how these resources are allocated. I use the library for pure research, getting stuff that I just can't get myself. And one thing that my students certainly have zero appreciation for until I drill this into their heads is that there's a lot of important stuff in books. It is not in journals that are available online. Books have some of the leading works in many of our fields are in books. So you've got to get books, physical books, read them, or if they're available online, get those. Those usually aren't free, and we don't have them all in our library. So the librarians are super helpful getting stuff from interlibrary loan all around the world. I've gotten books from South America, stuff that's really hard to find. The library is very helpful with that. As far as my RAs, it really depends on the RA. I do a number of projects that involve sort of data collection, code, find and code these 200 licensing agreements, or every case in which an injunction was denied in a patent case, and code it in some way. That's definitely something I'm not going to do myself, and it is something that RAs can do. And I've always got those types of projects going on. Sometimes, if students are good writers, I get them to write pieces, like the methodology section, some of the findings, and so forth. And also, I'm pretty generous giving students co-authorship credit on some of these papers. If the student has actually written, some piece or pieces of the paper, I put them on as second, third authors. I mean, I think like Robin, that's sort of what you do in the science world. The scientific threshold for authorship. I know I've gotten to be an author for contributing 3 sentences to other people's papers. And so I feel like doing that more. But, I generally do the writing myself. I definitely conceptualize the thing. But students doing their research, I tell them, look for trends, look for patterns, what's happening in these cases, what are the courts saying about this particular issue? And sometimes they make great original observations, and those go into the paper. Those become important parts of the thesis.
That's great. Robin, Paul, how do you guys use RAs and library resources best?
I find I love using students when I'm entering in a field that's new to me. At this point, there's absolutely no purpose in me using a student for the Clean Water Act because I know it better from memory than they're going to find in research. But I've just started a huge aquaculture project, and so I hired a bunch of students this summer to go out. I signed them each 3 states, and I said, go out and give me here's the template I want you to follow. Tell me about aquaculture in this culture, in this coastal state. And I've got a whole bunch of memos, and that's one of my projects for December. Sit through and see what patterns I see across states. Like George, I use them, go find every case where X has happened. And that's a wonderful way of doing data collection. The ones that I'm comfortable can research in other disciplines. It's like, hey, go find me all the interdisciplinary articles or articles on other disciplines on this, that, or the other, and tell me what's out there beyond law. So yeah, I think all that is wonderful. I'm pretty scrupulous about not letting them write unless I am willing to give them co-authorship credit, which I have done on occasion, but that's usually a research assistant who's been with me for a while. And I am very careful about how I use the research they've produced. If they have come up with an idea that I think deserves credit, I make sure that they get it.
That's great. Paul?
Yeah, I'll just echo what George and Robin said, but I'll also add, I think one area that the research assistants can be extremely useful in is the literature search. That is right in their power alley. Give me all the articles dealing with X topic in the last 20 years in these following databases. That's a project that's, manageable, discrete, and the product that comes back is usually pretty good. A lot of times I'll say, I want a one paragraph summary of each of these articles. They can maybe just download the abstract, and then it becomes very efficient for me to, review 30 articles in maybe 10 minutes that would have taken, hours and hours on my own. So that's one area that I tend to use RAs very heavily. Also, like Robin and George, I tend to do co-authorship. I believe in incentives, and there's nothing like saying, hey, would you like to be a co-author to sort of up the ante from the research assistant's point of view. So.
Thank you so much. I think I just want to end with one point that Robin was going to make. I mean, we've learned a lot in this. There's almost too much to absorb. We'll have to go back to the notes. But Robin, do you want to just make your last point? We'll just conclude on that as far as I asked the question of, what should you say no to in order to stay productive? And I think you had a good point about creativity. And if you don't mind making that, I think it's a good point to end on.
Yeah. So what I said when Shima asked is you got to figure out what stimulates your creativity and what kills it. And that's going to be different for different people. For me, when I go to a conference, especially an interdisciplinary conference, I come out with a bazillion. I've got George's list on speed, a bazillion new things I want to investigate and write about. And so for me, those are worth doing, even though they are time consuming, because it keeps the research agenda and the creativity flowing, or it changes how I'm doing something I'm already doing. On the other hand, for me, what I call writing to spec, you've been told what to write about and how long to write about it, gets really old really quickly. So I try not to have more than one of those going at any given moment. And I've been saying no to a lot of those requests recently, just because I've got my own stuff I want to get back to.
I love that. Don't do anything that stifles your creativity. I think that's a beautiful message to end on. Thank you all so much for joining us in this Rocky Mountain Scholarship Impact panel. I really want to thank our panelists for being very honest and very helpful. Paul, George, Robin, thank you so much for all that you do to contribute to scholarly efforts and all that you've done to help all of us to improve in those efforts. So thank you all so much. Thanks for participating. Feel free to send our panelists any feedback or additional questions that you might have. I know we didn't get to cover people's questions in the queue, but feel free to reach out. The conversation is open, but we thank you all for coming today.